Get Richard on the line here. Hey, brother. Good morning. You ready for class? Okay, buddy. There we go. All right. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Um, we are going to continue our study of the Gospel of John this morning. We're going to be starting in chapter 2. And this is when the Gospel of John, of course, we said the first chapter is kind of a prologue, and then it's kind of an immediate history of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right? When he shows up and talks about John the Baptist and John the Baptist's testimony, and talks about Jesus calling his first few disciples. Um, and then really chapter 2 starts the collection of events that show up in mostly lots of dialogue with Jesus and people, but also the miracles and things like that. And this, of course, is the first miracle, the wedding feast at Cana. So we're going to read the first 12 verses here for context, and then we'll dive in. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of the purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who drew the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs did Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, and his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. And then it goes into another account. Um, all right, so this has some. Of course, we've all, if you've ever been around reading the Gospels and been around in church, you've heard this story, right? This story is really commonly shared. And the first couple of things just to notice is, remember in chapter 1 it said, and after this, and the next day, and it was really temporal. It was saying this day this happened, this day this happened, this day. It was like days in a row. And here it says, "And on the third day." And so it could mean that this was the next day, right? Because they're all up in that area. They head back over to Cana of Galilee, or it could mean that it was the third day of the week, which would have been Wednesday, right? Because Sunday was the first, or Tuesday, because Sunday is the first day of the week. One way or the other, they go to a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, and it says the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. So that's, doesn't sound too unusual. It's like people got married, they brought their friends and family and kin, to come. And when it says in verse 3, when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, why would that have been an issue? Got any ideas? They didn't have Sprite back then, that's true. Didn't have anything pretty much but wine and water, right? Um, why would have that been an issue? Well, yeah, the water's probably polluted. The water is. The water there was all kinds of issues about that. Even Paul told Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake, right? Um, but well, if you had a wedding, I mean, what do we do when we have a wedding? Do we have refreshments at a wedding? Very often. Hmm. Yeah, the catering. And they just use it generally with meals too. I mean, they use wine a lot. right? Okay, yeah. So the bride and the bridegroom, right, and probably their families, like we do now. The husband of the bride, whatever, the father of the bride ends up paying for the wedding, whatever our tradition is. It's just tradition. But they run out of wine. So you think about what would happen today if there was a wedding and they went back and there were like, let's say it's a small wedding, about 50 people show up for the wedding, and they go back for the celebration and refreshments, and there's one bottle of Sprite and a box of crackers, and that's it. Maybe a little bit of cheese for the crackers, and that's it. Yeah. Right, and so yeah, Jewish traditional Jewish weddings are a longer event, several days. But what would happen to the family? Well, they'd be embarrassed, right? They'd be embarrassed. I mean, if you were there and everybody came to your wedding and they're kind of going like, okay, let's go back and celebrate the wedding. They go back and go, they'd be embarrassed. So what's interesting here is that this is the thing that happens. They run out of wine, but notice what happens. The mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, the interesting thing is, first of all, anybody could have told if they ran out of wine. Anybody could have known, right? Because all of a sudden there's no more to drink. So anybody could have noticed this. But Mary says to Jesus, "They have no wine," and then Jesus says, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour is not yet come." It's like, so Jesus, anyway, his response is, basically, what am I to do about it? Right? Yeah. Well, what are? That's a good question we're going to talk about in a minute, because this says right down there in verse 11, this beginning of signs Jesus did. So he hadn't been doing miracles before this. How did we're going That's why we're having this little discussion about Mary. This is a big part of this particular account, right? Is what's going on. Well, first of all, if Mary, who was attending the wedding, came and said, "Hey, Jesus, they're out of wine," and the family was going to be embarrassed, it's at least possible. It's not, written. It's at least possible that this was part of her family. These were relatives, and she wanted, for their behalf, and may have just been out of compassion, she didn't want them to be embarrassed. She said, "We got a problem here." Now, the question is, the question that Art just asked was, okay, did Mary expect Jesus to do a miracle? Why? Well, did he have to? I mean, what was the problem? Right, right. It could be. Um, so, what was Jesus' status in his family, in his earthly family? Hmm? He was the firstborn man, right? He was also a full age, right? So it's also entirely possible that Mary looks to her firstborn son, whether or not Joseph is alive right now, we don't know, right? But if he's not alive, Jesus is literally the head of his family. He's the head male in his family. That question doesn't have to be, "Hey, are you going to perform a miracle about this?" It could just be, "Can we help him get some wine?" Period. It doesn't have to be, right? This is why I wanted to just research this a little bit. Of course, Jesus does a miracle, and we all know he did a miracle, and we know Mary says, whatever he says to you to do it. She tells the servants. But he could have just as easily said, hey, go down and buy some more wine. He could have. It isn't an explicit request to perform a miracle. That's what's important. Now, Jesus' comment is interesting here. Sometimes, especially in the South, we kind of raise an eyebrow when we read this language. He says, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? If that happened in the South, we'd say that he's a little peeved. We would say that, right? Because you don't say woman. You say that here in the South, you're not real happy with somebody. But that's not what that word means, and that's obviously not what Jesus says. It's a very generic word, right? But it is interesting that he didn't say mother. It's just interesting. But he says, what does your concern have to do with me? And then he says, my hour has not yet come. And this is where you get a hint that Jesus is thinking that she's saying, I know you're special. Can you do anything about this? This is all we can do, right? This is all we got. That's the whole story. We don't have another chapter explaining what Jesus' head was or Mary's head was, or we don't know. But you get a little hint right here, because Jesus' reply is, my hour has not yet come. Right. So, what did Mary know about Jesus? She'd been living with him for 30 years, right? Okay. We've already kind of answered the question, but had Jesus performed any miracles up until this point, according to the scripture? Nope. Because it says, this beginning of signs Jesus did in the Cana of Galilee. That's all we've got. That's the only information anybody's got. There's what scriptural information do we have about the youth of Jesus from his birth until this time? What scriptural information do we have about his life and what he did? It's only a few verses. Yes. He was 12 years old in the temple, and he spent all his time in the temple talking to the teachers and asking them questions and answering their questions, and everyone was amazed at what he knew. And he kind of hung around too long. And the family, with the caravan took off, and they had to come back and find him. That's what we know about him when he's 12. What else do we know? He what?
He grew in wisdom and stature.
It says he grew in wisdom and stature. We know that. What else do we know? What do we know about Jesus in his time in the synagogue? Did he just come and sit in the back? How do we know that? It says that he got up, he stood up to read, and this is, of course, when he reads that thing, he says, this scripture is fulfilled in your ears. But it says he got up to read as his custom was. So he was someone who was willing to stand up and read the scriptures in front of the congregation. That was something he did regularly. But we don't have any, and of course we have his youth, okay, how old was Jesus when they left Jerusalem? When they ran off to Egypt? Around 2-ish, and why do we know that? Why do we guess that, really? And Herod killed, he said he sent off to have every child killed 2 and under, every male child killed 2 and under in Bethlehem, because he had diligently inquired of the wise men, right? So there was some knowledge there that he was probably about this old. So he's about 2. So how long did they stay in Egypt? We don't know, but they come back, and we could probably, if you got out your, when Herod got to wherever and died and all that kind of stuff, you could probably get a guess, but it was probably a couple of years. So he comes back, but that's all we know. He went on that trip, right? That's all we know. It doesn't say anything about what Jesus did. Doesn't say about his behavior. What does it say about Mary during all this time? The few events that we have about Jesus. What does it say about Mary's response to those events? She treasured them up in her heart, right? And so she's keeping an eye on this. Well, shouldn't she? I mean, it's her firstborn son. You think maybe every mama keeps an eye on their child? Kind of tracks them, knows what's going on. Mary, of course, had other reasons to keep an eye on this child that had to do with this visit by the angel Gabriel, right? And the angels, and the wise men showing up. I mean, there was something special going on here. And Mary had been told by the angel how special Jesus was going to be. But the angel didn't say he's going to do a bunch of miracles. So Mary knew he was special. He knew he was, and just watching his life says he was tempted just as we were in all manner, but without sin. He's a 30-year-old man by this time. If your mama, hey guys, by by the time you were 30 years old, had your mama been able to recognize that you'd probably been sinful? Yes. Had we had struggles with sin by the time we were 30 years old, guys? Yes. So she observed Jesus and knew that he was special in that way too. But that's all she knows. She knows she's very special. She was told by the angel that he's going to be, this great person. And so she tells him to do it. And he says, now, why would Jesus say, my hour has not yet come? Well, yeah, true. Stephen said that Jesus keeps saying that until basically he's crucified, right? Until it's time for him to go to Jerusalem and be crucified. That's true. But if you said it's not time yet, which is basically a way to say that, right? It's not time yet. What does that imply about what Jesus is thinking? Why would he say it's not time yet? Now, that's a good question. If that's the case, I tend to agree with you. It seems to be pretty obvious from what he's saying, but why would he say that? Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I was thinking, and I think that's a really good point. Even if Jesus wasn't thinking when she first said he's thinking, no, it's not time yet. He ends up going ahead and doing it. Did Jesus have power over when he performed a miracle? Could he make a decision to perform a miracle or not? Yeah, sure he could. It was in his control, right? And so when he says this, it's like, think about, now we know Jesus is 30 years old. He comes down, he's baptized by John. He goes out in the wilderness for 40 days, doesn't eat, is tempted by Satan. He comes back and starts gathering some disciples, and he ends up here in Cana. So during this time, remember we talked last week about the time that Jesus was alone before he started collecting disciples. Was he thinking about all the future going on? Yeah. Now, Jesus is man, but he's also still God. Does he know what's going to happen in 3 years when he walks down carrying that cross? Yes, he does. But so is he making plans of what he's going to do? I mean, Jesus decides to go places, right? He says, hey, let's go up to Galilee. Hey, let's go back down to Jerusalem. Hey, let's go over and wake up Lazarus, right? He's in control. So he decides at this point, probably by Mary's prompting about the situation, he said, okay, I'm going to perform one. She didn't ask him to perform a miracle. She knew he was special. But she said, can you help? Because they're going to get embarrassed. And it might even be family. You want family to get embarrassed. Yeah.
But I wonder if there was an element of, you know what you're asking me to do. You know what's going to come
Ooh.
of this ministry of mine starting now.
Wow. Wow. That's a really interesting comment. I'm going to repeat that. So, see if I can get it right. was his response to Mary saying, "Do you really want to get this ball rolling?" Basically, right? Do you know where this is going? You know, there's this really beautiful song, "Mary, Did You Know?" Right? And it's kind of like that. Um, that's interesting. I mean, you always wonder what dinner conversation was like at the Joseph home, right? What kind of discussions Jesus had with his parents all of his growing up, and when John the Baptist came around, he's still at home with his parents, and he's talking about what's going on with John the Baptist. I would love to know. I'd love to know, but we don't. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. Now let's get into actually what he does. So Mary says, whatever to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Now, why would she have the authority to do that? To tell the servants what to do? I think this is another little bit of evidence that it's probably a family situation, right? That she's one of the family members. Like recently, we went to a wedding. It was Jordan and Abby's wedding. It was Joyce and Rich's wedding, and they had an aunt and a daughter who were running the wedding, right? And they were the ones in charge, and you knew who was in charge, and you did what they said, right? All the people who were serving and putting on the wedding, they would go to them and ask the questions they knew. So maybe that's a little bit of evidence. Okay, so what does Jesus actually do? So here we go. Now there were 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them to the brim. And then he said, "Draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. Now, I found it fascinating. I'm always interested in numbers. So these water pots, there were 6 water pots of stone. They're made of stone, 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Okay? 20 or 30 gallons apiece means, where do I have it written down? I have it written down here somewhere. Oh, yeah. So a gallon is 8.5 pounds. 20 to 30 gallons is 170 to 255 pounds. There's a stone jar big enough to hold that many gallons. 30 gallons. Let's just say it's 30 gallons. That's how many 5-gallon buckets? That's 6 5-gallon buckets. That's a lot. That's a big pot. It's made out of stone. Now, even if that was something that they had turned really thin, right? I'm a wood turner, so I know a little bit about turning. This is not wood. This is made out of stone. Even if they made it really thin, that much stone probably weighed somewhere on the order of 70 to 80 pounds. It's a lot of stone. So each one of these jars was probably 200 to 300 pounds. And there's 6 of them. That's not a small request. If you're we don't know how many servants there were, right? But if somebody said to you, "Okay, dude, I want you to go get a whole mess of, 100, what did I say, 300 pounds. I want you to go get 6 300-pound jars full of water, and I want you to bring them back." That's a major job. By the way, I did a little calculation. You know how much wine is in a wine bottle, kind of standard wine bottle? About 1/5 of a gallon. This means that there was the equivalent in wine of 600 to 900 bottles of wine. That just blew me away. I thought, well, it's a lot. You just kind of see it's a big, big jar. No, it's 600, 700, 800 bottles of wine worth of wine. Is he providing a lot of wine for a lot of people? Yeah. Was it probably a big wedding? Yeah. It might have had the whole town there. We don't know, right? But the amount of wine he produces here is a bit of evidence that gives you something to think about. It's a pretty massive amount. So they do all this. They take it to the master of the feast. So there's some guy that was running the show, right? And he tasted the wine, and he called the bridegroom, and he says, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, but when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior wine, but you kept the good wine until now." So we've got a little bit of wine tasting going on here. And what does he say? He tastes the wine. He's a master of ceremonies. Does he know good wine from bad wine? By the way, this is probably a really big wedding because they've got, hundreds of bottles of wine. If he knows wine, what's he going to say? He's going to be able to tell by tasting it how good it is. Yeah. And he's impressed that this wine is so much better than whatever they had before. Now, when they serve wine, we think of when people have a bottle of wine or something now, It's grape juice, right? It's grape juice that's been fermented. A lot of times in these days, they watered down the wine, right? They would serve the full, wine, pure wine by itself, or they'd water it down. So the wine might have been watered down. It might not have been a good quality. We know that wine vinegar was a common drink of the workmen, which was wine that had gone sour that was mixed with water, right? So this is kind of the comparisons. But he says, "Hey, this is really great wine." He goes and gets the bridegroom, gets the groom. He says, "Why did you do this? This is a real mistake. You should have put out all the good wine." But why did he say that? When the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. One of the things that people want to talk about and argue about with this particular thing was, did Jesus make alcoholic wine? You ever heard that argument? People want to say, did Jesus make alcohol for people to drink? Well, yeah, he did. How do you know that? He didn't. A couple of interesting things. The Greek word for wine can mean fermented or unfermented, so it doesn't have to be. But here's the clue: when the guests have well drunk, that word "well drunk" there is methuo, and it means to drink to intoxication. It doesn't just mean they've had a little and they're satisfied. It means to drink to intoxication. So yeah, he's basically saying by the time people, are starting to get drunk, they don't care what the wine tastes like anymore, or not as much anyway. But he said, obviously, you've got it backwards. Do you have an opinion, Stephen,
So,
or more evidence?
so the fact that this word that does not necessarily speak the quality of the wine that Jesus made. He's giving
A general statement.
yes,
That's a good point.
a general statement, and perhaps describing the quality of the wine that came before, but not necessarily the wine that Jesus had made. Two, this was a while back, but they had a lesson a while back about how and while it's not an inspired book, still had an historical commentary at the end of Second Maccabees, where it mentions that the better wine is the more diluted wine, and that was the sweeter at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is a general sentiment that existed in the second century BC when that was written,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps in the first century AD,
Mm-hmm.
there was the same.
So, is it possible that this wine was basically diluted grape juice or diluted wine? Could be. Could it just be fresh wine? Could it be new wine? Yeah. Although new wine is another complicated thing because we think of that as like, okay, if you just get grape juice, right? It's not fermented yet. But what do they say to Peter on Pentecost when they're speaking in tongues and somebody's saying these guys are full of new wine? They're basically saying they're drunk. Peter says they're not drunk. So the thing is, we wish we had a lot more information, but we don't. The point is, the guy who was the bridegroom, the guy who was over all this stuff, he knew wine. He said it was really good wine. That's all we know, right? It doesn't say, wow, this has got a big kick, it's got a lot of alcohol in it, or hey, it's just really sweet wine, or man, it's got a great flavor, you diluted it just perfectly. And so we have to look for other little bits of evidence, like Maccabees, right? Okay. What would it mean? Go ahead, Art.
You said that about that man saying that somebody, the guy at the table said, certain time in the morning, we ain't drunk here.
Right, because people didn't because they would have done it through the day, and you get into a whole bunch of other discussions about of the quality and kind of wine they had and the amount of alcohol in non-fortified wine. Like most wine today oftentimes is fortified. They've actually added alcohol to it to give it more of a kick. How much would you have had to drink to get drunk? You can go into all that technical stuff, but I just wanted to bring up the point here that it was really good wine. That's what the guy says. That's really the only hard piece of evidence we have. And he did say, by the way, normally people are intoxicated by the time they bring out the bad wine, right? The less good wine. Okay. The other little bit I'm just gonna throw in here is it's good to know too, having been a chemist, we have another chemist in the room to validate me. If you put fresh squeezed grape juice in a jar and set it out on the counter and leave it there for a day or two, I guarantee you there is yeast in it doing its job and it's starting to ferment. Every tiny amount, in fact, probably in an hour or two, because there's yeast all over the place. There's yeast in the breeze. Yeast spores are everywhere on earth. And so any grape juice you ever get in your mouth probably has a teeny molecular batch of alcohol in it. Does it matter? No, it doesn't. Because what does the scripture say about wine in particular and drunkenness? We're not supposed to get drunk. Christians are not supposed to get drunk. Does that mean we never, ever, ever, ever have any alcoholic thing ever in our mouth? No, it doesn't mean that. By the way, if you ever take cough syrup, you've had some alcohol in your mouth, right? But what does it mean? Don't get drunk. Don't get drunk. That's the prohibition. And of course, you know, Paul tells Stephen, take a little wine for your stomach's sake and your often infirmities, right? Timothy, sorry, you're right. I get them mixed up. I'm glad you're correcting. Yeah. Yeah. No. You're asking for it. Yeah. Yeah. So Alvin's talking about his experiences. He worked a lot of years in third world countries, and he said, you do not drink the water, you are going to get violently sick. And I've done it. And I've got accidentally. One time I just brushed my teeth, and that was enough, and violently sick from the parasites in the water when I was down there. But, yeah, go ahead.
There is another tea. What is believed to have a lot of benefits and whatnot. And in some cases it does, but it got started because drinking tea was healthier than drinking water because you have to boil the water first.
Right.
They didn't realize that at first.
Right.
But when they realized, they just associated tea with healthier things than water.
Yeah, the people who drank tea didn't get sick. That was called.
Or
But they didn't understand the boiling part.
I'm not sure about Palestine.
Not in this period of time, but
I'm sure China definitely had tea in India. I'm not sure about
yeah, it was over in the eastern part. It wasn't really there. But they had beer. You know, the Egyptians made beer too. So I mean, there were fermented drinks, right? That there were fermented drinks. There was beer and wine that was fermented, either fruit or grain mash that was done. And you know, it's one of those things. When I went to Honduras, I don't drink alcoholic drinks, but if you wanted to drink, you got a Coke because it's coming out of the bottle from the bottling plant. But you know what? I was there one time and someone opened a Coke and they came and put a straw in it. I said, no, thank you. I don't use a straw. And a doctor who was next to me said, you will use the straw or you will get sick because the amount of stuff that's just on the outside of that glass is enough to make you sick. And it was like, okay, I'll use a straw. You know, it really is us nortes, you know, us people up here in the north, we don't understand what it's like to live in just common filthy water. And that's something, I don't know, huge percentage of the world has untreated water, right? It's a real issue. Okay, back to the scripture. So he says, this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So the reason I wanted to there's two things I wanted to bring up. One before we leave Mary. One of the things that Catholic doctrine uses this little setting to say is if you ever want Jesus to do something for you, you should ask Mary first. And that's one of the justifications they have for praying to Mary, is they make an argument that Jesus will listen to his mama. See, they'll point to this verse, so you can pray to Mary instead of praying to God. Not scripture, folks, but that's where they get it. That's where they get it. And then they build a whole thing about praying to other saints and all that kind of stuff out of it. But that's that little verse where it happens. Now, this first of signs, first of miracles, we talked about what the Bible actually says about what Jesus did. But the reason that this is still around, and there are, Christian denominations, and Catholicism is one, and not the only one, that say that Jesus did a bunch of miracles as a child. Where they get that from, the first document that shows up is something called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Now, it's not the same as the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. And of course, all those are ones that are refuted. They're not assumed to be inspired. But there's one called the Infancy Gospel that talks about Jesus between ages 5 and 12 performing miracles. Here are some of the miracles it talks about. Some of these you may have heard about. At age 5, Jesus was playing with some clay, and he formed some clay sparrows on the Sabbath, which of course would have been violating the Sabbath because he's doing work. At least the Pharisees would have said so. And then clapping his hands to make them fly away as living birds. And this is actually in some songs. I've actually heard some songs about Jesus making a bird out of clay and blessing it until it flies away. I've actually heard those songs in my lifetime. By the way, that story shows up in the Quran. Surah 5, verse 110, if you want to look it up. Now, the Quran, of course, didn't come around until 400 or 500 years after Jesus. So it wasn't written down until about 500 years after. And of course, isn't inspired. Here's another one. Cursing a boy who scatters his gathered water, causing the boy to wither and die. Here's another one. Accidentally or angrily, this is all coming from the same document, causing another child's death by bumping into him, and then later resurrecting playmates or others who died. Healing his brother James from a snake bite, resurrecting a fallen worker, or stretching wood to help Joseph in carpentry. Now that one's a hoot because I don't know, that whole measure twice, cut once, right? That whole about the reason is because we always end up cutting it the wrong. When you're building stuff with wood, getting it the right length is always a challenge. I saw one the other day that said measure once, cuss twice, because that's about what you do. But here he said, "Oh, I'll fix that for you, Joseph." Now, a carpenter would have loved this. I mean, we would have loved this because you're always getting stuff the wrong size. Because it's not in the Bible. Outwitting and sometimes cursing teachers who tried to instruct him. Other apocryphal texts, like the Arabic Infancy Gospel or the Proto-Evangelium of James, include similar infancy wonders like during the flight to Egypt. And so these are books that came 100 years or later after Jesus, okay? This is like we talked about before when we were talking about John writing this toward the end of the first century, and that afterward you started seeing the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnosticism and other kinds of books. And so just to show you, that's where they get this stuff. There's some guy sat down and wrote a bunch of fanciful stories, a bunch of imaginary stories, but one of my friends would have called it fan fiction. They kind of took the idea and they wrote it, and they said, here, we're going to make up some stuff. And of course, it's got all kinds of problems because cursing a boy who just dropped some water, causing him to die. I mean, what do we know about Jesus from the scripture? Right. He was tempted in all ways as we were, and yet without sin. Would those things been sin? Right. Self-serving. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To answer your question,
And others.
that
Yeah.
were not, well, I think the technical name would be like historical fiction, where somebody just came up
Right.
and the idea is in Gnosticism, the idea is there are always gaps in time and history that we don't know that much about. Like the 30 years between Jesus' birth and the beginning of his ministry, we don't know a lot. A few things that you mentioned earlier, and they like to try to fill in those.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe they have a reason for some of those, but a lot of them do seem to go against Jesus.
And if you watch the later documents that show up over the next 1,000 years or more, where somebody says, I found an ancient document, and it tells about this time of Jesus that we'd never heard of before. Do we ever see that on the internet today? Have you read the Gnostic Gospels? Why has the church banned it? It contains the truth and the real secret. Fanciful, and played up. Have you read the Ethiopian Bible? They've got the real truth, right? There's all this kind of sensationalism that's wrapped around. There's some sort of set of secrets there that aren't in the Bible, that we got to have, that are essential or something like that. We still have that today. Hey, by the way, if you discovered one of these books back in, say, 600, however it got wrote, if you discovered one of those and you started taking it around, you think maybe you could have sold it? Yeah, people were collecting this stuff. So there's a lot of fake stuff out there that was written. And there's even stuff that probably was allegorical, meant to just encourage Christians. Like, have you ever read the book Hind's Feet on High Places? It's a really beautiful book, right? And it's this allegory of this woman who in the book is named Much Afraid, who's dealing with tragedy in her life and problems in her life, and Jesus is teaching her through her suffering how to rely on God. It's an allegory. It's not meant to be scripture. It doesn't claim to be scripture. It's just saying, it's letting you think about this stuff and thinking, maybe my suffering has purpose for God. Maybe God is helping me learn. You can learn good stuff from allegories, but it's not scripture. And so you sometimes you'll see that stuff and it shows up later. Somebody finds it and goes, we found the missing Gospel of Joe or something, right? So some of this stuff isn't necessarily nefarious, but some of it is nefarious. It's just flat lie. Build something sensational, get a bunch of people interested, get them to follow you or get them to give you money or some combination of both. Okay, we're about at the end. Do we have any other comments or questions about this before we're going to dive in cleansing the temple. That's a whole nother discussion. Okay, the last thing I want to say about this is the last verse. And it says, after this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. Now, why is that there? I mean, is there a really significant message in this statement? I frankly don't think so, right? But this is evidence. This is evidence that this is testimony. Because he's saying, we were there. And oh yeah, after this, all of us left the wedding and we went down to Capernaum and we hung out there for a few days. It says not many days. We didn't go down there for very long. Well, of course, the very next verse, when it starts out, it says, and Jesus went down for the Passover, he ends up cleansing the temple. But this is a bit of history. This is a bit of evidence that says this was somebody's real testimony. Because someone just making up the story, they wouldn't have said this. This doesn't add any real value to the story, except it tells us a little more about who was at the wedding. It said it was Jesus' brother, was his mother and his brothers. You say, well, where were his sisters? He had sisters. They were probably all married off by now, frankly, given the likely ages of these people. But that's all we know. Could be. And like I said, we just don't know. But we know the rest of the family is there. That is something new we learned, because earlier it just says Jesus is there and his disciples. That's all we know. So if the whole family was there, it was probably a family affair. It was probably relatives. And that kind of lends a little more credence to what was going on. But that's it. All right. Thank you very much.